The young and the restless spoilers for years, Nicholas Newman had buried a gnawing suspicion deep within his soul, one that he had never dared to fully voice even to himself. It was not born of a single moment or harsh word, but from an entire lifetime of feeling like an outlier within the very family he had pledged his life to. Despite his efforts, despite his loyalty, despite being the son who never tried to steal the family empire from under Victor's shadow the way Adam did, Nick had always felt as though he was viewed as something less. There had always been a subtle hesitation in Victor's tone when he spoke his name, a coldness in his eyes that no father should ever direct at a child who had done everything to earn his love. It wasn't simply neglect. It was as if Nick was a living embodiment of disappointment, someone Victor kept close only because the world demanded appearances. And no matter how much Nick pushed those feelings down, rationalized them, or drowned them in his own attempts to be better than the man who had raised him, they festered beneath the surface, growing stronger with every slight, every public snub, every whispered conversation that stopped when he entered the room. The only consistent source of warmth and compassion had been Nikki. Her unwavering support had often been the thread keeping Nick tethered to the Newman name, to the house, to the idea that he did belong, somehow, somewhere. But even her affection had begun to feel complicated. It was not just maternal love, it was protective, sometimes overly so, sometimes desperate. Nikki didn't just defend him. She defended him as though he were in danger, as though some unspeakable truth might someday rise and engulf him. That tenderness began to take on a darker shade in Nick's mind, especially when paired with Victor's aloofness. Could it be that Nikki loved him more, because she had to? Because she knew something that Nick didn't? Because the illusion of family was the only shield standing between him and a truth that would destroy everything he believed about who he was? And then it came? The moment no one could have predicted, and yet, in retrospect, had been inevitable. Out of the silence of Nick's doubts stepped a man who had no place in the Newman saga but every reason to enter it. Aristotle Dumas, a name whispered in scandal, a rival in business and in character, a man who had always carried with him an air of unfinished vengeance. He didn't come with fury. He didn't come with an army. He came with a single sheet of paper and a certainty in his voice that chilled every corner of Nick's fractured soul. A DNA test, conclusive and irrefutable, marked not with the colors of war but with the cold precision of science. It declared in stark, unfeeling letters what Nick's heart had feared since childhood: Victor Newman was not his father. Aristotle Dumas was. The world did not stop spinning, but for Nick, it may as well have. In that instant, the foundation of his identity cracked beneath his feet. Every memory of loyalty, of betrayal, of punishment and praise, reframed itself in this new cruel light. He thought back to childhood birthdays Victor had missed, to the moments when his triumphs were met with silence, when his failures were magnified. How much of that was shaped by knowledge Victor had kept hidden from the world, and from Nick? How often had Victor punished him, not because of who Nick was, but because of who he wasn't? The pieces began to fit with agonizing clarity. Nikki's fierce devotion, her sidelong glances at Victor when Nick's name was mentioned, the nights she drank too much and clung to him as though holding on for dear life, she had known. She had known the entire time. And Victor, he had known too. And yet neither of them had ever offered him the dignity of truth. But Aristotle wasn't there simply to offer revelation. He came with a proposition, one so audacious that it sounded like madness at first. He told Nick that this was not just a betrayal of identity, it was an opportunity for rebirth. That he, Aristotle, had long watched Victor twist his empire into a monument of ego and control, that he had watched Nick be humiliated, undervalued, and cast aside. And now, with this truth revealed, Aristotle believed it was time for Nick to take back what had never truly been Victor's to withhold. Newman Enterprises was built not just by Victor's vision, but by the sacrifices and labor of everyone who bore the Newman name, Nick included. And now, with this revelation in hand, Nick could challenge Victor not as a son desperate for love, but as a man with nothing left to lose. What Aristotle was asking of him was not vengeance, he claimed, but justice. But Nick couldn't help but feel the edges of something darker beneath the words. To overthrow Victor was not just a business maneuver, it was a declaration of war on the very myth that held Genoa City in its grip. And who was he really, if not Victor's son? Was he ready to sever the ties that, though twisted and painful, had defined his entire existence? Yet for the first time in his life, Nick had something Victor could not ignore. A secret that could humiliate the old man, dismantle his legacy, expose him not as a powerful patriarch but as a fool clinging to a lie. The temptation was there, heavy and seductive. Still, it was not an easy choice. Nick's heart was torn between fury and grief, betrayal and freedom. He thought of his siblings, of Victoria who had always played the dutiful heir, of Adam whose pain now mirrored his own in cruel irony, of Abby who had her own battles for legitimacy. He thought of his children, of what it would mean to teach them that bloodlines were weapons and that revenge was a path to identity. And he thought of Nikki, the woman who gave birth to him, who carried the burden of this truth every day of his life and chose to lie to protect, what? Her marriage? Her son? Or both? But in the shadows of Newman Tower, behind boardroom doors and walls lined with glass and betrayal, the storm was already brewing. Aristotle had planted the seed. Nick now held the power to reshape the narrative. He could bring Victor to his knees not with fists or fury, but with the one thing Victor had never expected, truth. It wasn't just about company shares or succession. It was about rewriting his origin story. No longer the forgotten son of an indifferent father, Nick had the chance to become his own man, carrying forward not the legacy of Victor Newman, but something entirely new. The whispers started. Quiet at first, then louder. Rumors of paternity tests, of shifting alliances. Board members exchanged glances, investors braced for impact. The Newman name, once a fortress, suddenly seemed vulnerable. Victor could feel it. Something had changed. He looked at Nick differently now, with a flicker of suspicion that perhaps the secret he had buried so long ago had finally unearthed itself. Nikki avoided eye contact. Even the air inside the ranch grew heavy with unsaid things. And Nick. He stood in the center of it all, the fulcrum of a secret that could redefine everything. The son of Victor? No. The heir to the empire? Maybe. But what mattered more now was the man he chose to be. Would he play Aristotle's game, become the avenging son raised in another man's house? Or would he walk away from the war, armed with the truth but unwilling to spill blood? ChatGPT DNOI, Nick's shock upon learning that Aristotle Dumas is his biological father can hardly be overstated. All his life, he believed himself to be the son of Victor Newman, heir to the sprawling empire of Newman Enterprises, and yet in an instant the very foundation of his identity was shattered. To go from believing that the man who raised him, flawed though Victor may have been, was his true father, to discovering that every memory of childhood, every birthday gift, every harsh reprimand or rare word of praise, had been rendered meaningless by a secret kept in darkness. It is a revelation so profound that it threatens to upend everything Nick thought he knew about himself. No wonder he freezes, unable to process whether this information is true or some cruel trick devised by a manipulative rival. Yet, as paralyzing as that moment of revelation might be, it also contains a spark of possibility. If Aristotle Dumas truly is Nick's father, then Nick is not merely the underappreciated younger son of a patriarch who always seemed to view him as an outsider. He is instead the scion of a different legacy, one that Aristotle claims to want him to carry forward. From Aristotle's vantage point, Newman Enterprises could very well be Nick's rightful birthright. Imagine the allure of that idea for Nick, a chance to prove that he is not the failure, the second-class son, the disappointment Victor treated him as. He could seize control of the very company he has long yearned to run in his own right, unshackled from years of half-hearted recognition and constant second-guessing. This is a tempting proposition, especially for someone whose self-esteem has been battered by a lifetime of living in Adam's, and even Adam's children's, shadows. But temptation alone cannot be reason enough. Nick's instincts whisper the possibility of a trap. Aristotle's timing raises questions. Why now? Why reveal such earth-shattering news at this precise moment? If Victor genuinely believed Nick was his son, what changed? Could it be that Aristotle has ulterior motives, perhaps financial gain, perhaps vengeance against Victor, or perhaps a ruthless desire to install an heir more pliable than Victor's own children? One false step in this labyrinth of half-truths and hidden agendas could leave Nick more isolated than ever, stripped of both paternal protectors. If he rejects Victor and throws in his lot with Aristotle, he risks losing the one true defender he has always had, his mother, Nikki. Nikki may have known this secret for years, may have protected Nick out of maternal love and fear for his emotional stability, but siding with Aristotle could fracture the fragile bond between Nick and Nikki the way it could fracture his relationship with Victor. What Nick needs now is clarity, and he must be clear about what he truly wants. If he wants to prove himself capable of running Newman Enterprises, he must ask whether that goal is worth the sacrifice of his family ties. Power is seductive, but the price of seizing it could be his place in a world he still half belongs to. If he galvanizes behind Aristotle and demands Victor's downfall, does he gain authentic loyalty, or merely become a pawn in a vendetta? Aristotle's motivations are hardly altruistic, he stands to gain as well. And even if his intentions toward Nick are genuine, aligning himself with Aristotle means stepping into a legacy of cutthroat maneuvering, not gentle guidance and mentorship. On the other hand, if Nick chooses to weigh his loyalties toward Victor, however strained that relationship has been, he must reconcile the betrayal he feels from his adoptive father's deception. Even if Victor's refusal to acknowledge him as fully his was the product of pride rather than disdain, Nick will need to decide whether forgiveness is possible. If he returns to Victor's side, he may find at least a door left open to family, but he will also need to demand honesty and accountability. Nick must insist that Victor explain why he kept the truth from him and why he continued to treat him as an outsider after knowing Nick was not his blood. That conversation is bound to be painful, but it represents Nick's best chance at rebuilding a relationship on a firmer foundation. If Victor refuses to come clean or continues to look down on Nick, then Nick can reconsider his alliance with Aristotle, at least with the knowledge that he attempted reconciliation. In this delicate moment, Nikki's role is crucial. She raised Nick, defended him, and hid this secret to protect him from the crushing blow too early in life. Now, she must do more than comfort her son, she must guide him toward discernment. Nikki has long understood the brutal realities of Victor's world, how power can destroy those who seek to wield it without fortitude, how secrets fester into resentments that bleed entire families dry. She also understands Aristotle's ruthless streak. Aligning with him may give Nick the facade of empowerment, but it may strip him of his moral compass. Nikki must remind Nick that being CEO of Newman Enterprises means more than sitting behind a desk with Victor's name on the door. It means upholding a complicated legacy, one built on triumphs for many innocent employees, but also on manipulations and betrayals. If Nick is to pursue that title, he must prove he has the integrity to lead, not just the bloodline or the test results. Nick's first step should be to seek the unvarnished truth. He needs to verify the DNA results independently, ideally in a neutral setting where no one can tamper with evidence. He must ask to see the test, ask who performed it, and confirm that Aristotle did not manufacture the documents. Only once Nick is certain that Aristotle's claim is factual should he contemplate the next move. If the results hold, Nick ought to confront Victor directly, ideally with Nikki's support present as a witness. He can ask Victor to explain why he kept this secret and request that Victor acknowledge their bond, however strained. If Victor persists in coldness or refuses to admit that Nick deserves respect regardless of blood, Nick will have to weigh whether that is a relationship worth preserving. But even if Victor disavows him after learning the truth, Nick should proceed with caution before embracing Aristotle's offer. There is no guarantee that Aristotle's vision for Nick as CEO is genuine. Nick must insist on clarity. What exactly does Aristotle demand in return for endorsing Nick's candidacy? Will Aristotle simply step aside after his ascension, or will Aristotle expect total obedience? Is there a hidden clause, say, a financial burden, that Nick would have to bear to secure control? All of these questions must be answered before Nick signs on to Aristotle's scheme. Ultimately, Nick's priority must be to preserve his own moral center. If he chooses to pursue power under Aristotle's shadow, he needs to decide what he will and will not do to achieve his goal. Will he sacrifice personal relationships? Will he compromise on his values by engaging in backdoor deals or vindictive maneuvers? The real trap, perhaps, is not Aristotle's invitation but the seductive notion that gaining power justifies any betrayal. Nick has spent his life learning, often painfully, what it feels like to be undervalued. Let him not make the mistake of undervaluing himself now by trading his ethics for a title that may prove empty without the love and respect of those who truly care for him. In the end, the question Nick is the son of who becomes less about biology and more about character. Being Victor's son may have felt restricting, but it came with a legacy of ambition and resilience that Nick has already inherited. If he is Aristotle's son, he gains access to a different kind of power. But he also inherits the cost of his father's vendettas. Nick must ask himself, am I willing to become a weapon against the father who raised me, just to prove that I'm not the failure he always suspected? Or can I forge a new path, one where legitimacy is measured not by DNA but by compassion, wisdom, and integrity? That is the question Nikki must help him answer, teaching him not simply right from wrong, but how to navigate a world where every revelation can be a double-edged sword.